Okay, so one of the major milestones in adult development is finding a partner, right? And specifically finding a partner to share your life with. And so we should spend a little time talking about romantic love. Whether or not you're able to find love, it does have consequences for how you define yourself in terms of your self concept. It also has consequences for your psychological well being. But it is influenced by many factors. Now, it's tough to study love, it's tough to define what that is, but we'll talk about some of the research on this. Now, one of the things that you've got to do in terms of finding that romantic love, of course, the first thing is to select a mate. So, how do we go about doing that? What are the things that lead us to one person versus another? Well, the number one thing is actually physical proximity, that we're more likely to partner with someone that lives near us, that is close by to us. That may not always be the case. That might change somewhere down the road because of all of the access that we have now to the internet and internet dating. However, the data still show that physical proximity is sort of the number one thing. So, what other kinds of things go into selecting a mate? Think about it for a second. We tend to select people that are very similar to us in terms of excuse me, all sorts of factors, including attitudes, personality, educational plans, also intelligence. We also tend to select mates that are similar to us in terms of our own physical attractiveness. There is actually very little support for that notion of opposites attract. I mean, you may attract one another, but in terms of a long term, long standing, successful relationship, opposites actually don't do so well. What predicts the most successful long-standing relationships is when there is a lot of similarity between the partners. Now, that said, there are some differences between men and women in what we look for, right? So, what do women tend to look for? They tend to look for things like ambition, financial status, intelligence, right? Those kinds of characteristics that are going to help offer some support. And men, on the other hand, look for what? The number one thing that men look for is physical attractiveness. And we've talked about this a bit before in terms of the evolutionary theory, right? That women have a limited capacity to reproduce, so they tend to seek a mate that will really help to ensure the survival of the few offspring that they're going to have. Men, on the other hand, look for characteristics that signal youth, because that is going to be a signal of ability to bear healthy offspring, right? And so, from an evolutionary perspective, there's just a different approach. And so, we have these different things that we're attracted to. Now, timing is also important here. That if you're not really ready for romantic love, if you're not really ready to select a mate in terms of your own development, regardless of what the social clock says, then jumping into a relationship, it probably isn't the best thing because it's probably not going to be long lasting. Sternberg has studied love a bit, and what he's proposed is that there are these three components of love. If you remember Sternberg, we talked about him before. We talked about him when we talked about intelligence, and he had the triarchic theory of intelligence. So I suppose Sternberg just likes things in threes. So, what are the three components? The first is intimacy. And what we would say about intimacy is that it is the emotional component of love. So, it's that warm, fuzzy feeling that you get, right, towards the other person, the concern that you have for their well being, and the desire you have for them to be concerned about your well being, etc. The second component is passion. So, if intimacy is the emotional component, then what would we say passion is? You probably said physical component, and that's true. That passion is that desire for sexual activity. It's also the desire for romance. It's that physical arousal and psychological arousal component. And the last component is commitment. So if intimacy is emotional, passion is physical, then what is commitment? Commitment would be that cognitive component, right? It's the decision that you make to stay with a partner, to maintain the love that you've developed with this partner. Now, these components show up in the context of a relationship in a developmental sequence. So they don't just all show up at once, right? So think for a second, what are the order in which these different components would show up? So you probably identified that passion is the first component, right? And that's true. Over the course of a relationship, passion is what shows up first. It's very strong in the beginning. Now, is it possible to maintain the same level of passion, the intensity of that passion that you typically have at the beginning of a relationship? Can you maintain that throughout a relationship? If you said no, then you're right, okay? That it's very difficult to maintain that high level of arousal, that high level of passion. It's very normal for that to drop off a bit over the course of a relationship. Then what typically comes next is intimacy, when you actually get to know someone. So it's interesting because it has been said that the very beginning of the relationship is probably the worst time to get to know someone, right? Because you're in that early stage, you're in that passion, and love tends to be blind, if you will, in that early period. And you tend to be putting your best foot forward, and so is the partner. And you tend to notice only the good things in them because of that physiological and psychological arousal. So the beginning of the relationship probably is not the best time to really get to know someone, but once you've been with someone for a period of time, then you can start to develop that intimacy. Okay, and then the last, of course, is the commitment. So once you've gotten to know someone, then you decide. You go through that series of day-to-day decisions to spend time together, to care for each other, to share things, and you make a decision to stay committed to that person. Now, what Sternberg says is that you can have different combinations of these three components of love. So you see from this chart that, let's say you are high in intimacy, but you really don't have passion or commitment. Then basically you guys are friends, right? You like each other a whole lot, but that's about it. If you're very high in passion, but not, you don't have the intimacy, you don't have the commitment, then you are infatuated. And that's typically what we have right at the very beginning in those early stages of a relationship. Now, if you don't have passion or intimacy, but you have commitment, then that is said to be empty love. So in what instances can you think of that empty love might take place? Sometimes you might see this in a very long-term relationship, right, where the partners are married with one another, they have the commitment, but they're no longer interacting very much as a couple. That doesn't mean that that has to happen. That's not an inevitable change in a long-term relationship, but sometimes that does happen. Now, if you have the passion and you have the intimacy, but you don't yet have commitment, then you have romantic love. If you've got passion and you've got commitment but no intimacy, then basically you don't know each other yet, right? But you've decided to be with this person anyway. So this is, the couple that decides to get married after only knowing each other for a very short period of time. Now, the most successful relationships are the last two types of love. So companionate love, maybe you don't have as much of the passion, but you definitely have the intimacy and the commitment. And then, of course, if you have all three, then those tend to be the more successful relationships. Now, what's interesting is that there are also some cultural differences in the way that we think about love and what we strive for in our romantic relationships. Romantic love, feeling like you're in love with someone or that you love someone, really didn't become a priority, a primary basis for marriage until about the 18th century. It became really a dominant factor in Western nations like the United States during the 20th century, as as this value of individualism that we have in our culture begin to get stronger. What's interesting is that if you asked participants in a study in the like let's say the 1950s or 60s, would you ever consider marrying someone that you didn't love or that you weren't in love with? In a sample at that time, the majority of the sample would have said yes, I would consider it. Now, if you redid that study starting in the 1980s and asked the same question, there would be a big switch, and the majority of the participants would say, no, I wouldn't consider marrying someone that I wasn't in love with. So what is it that happened during that time? If you think about it, over that period of time, what we have is women's entry back into the workforce, right? So they're not at home as much anymore, and they are out in the workplace, and so they are becoming more and more financially stable independently. And so they don't really require someone to support them financially anymore. And so with that transition, all of a sudden you get this huge emphasis on that feeling of love, or that you're in love with someone. And we do in the United States put a high stake in that, in really feeling passionate about someone. What's interesting about that, however, is that it's not terribly realistic, right, to emphasize this very high passion. And it's not realistic because, as we've talked about, the passion will tend to decline over the course of a relationship just naturally. Okay? So it's very interesting. Now, if you look at comparisons across cultures, in the United States, what we consider to be mature love is a love that is based on autonomy, that we still, as a couple, have some independence. We're still our own people, right? That you don't become totally enmeshed with the other person. And if you have one member of the partner that's overly dependent or overly needy or clingy, that's seen as something that's undesirable. We also tend to really look for a partner that has unique qualities. And this comes from our individualistic approach, right? That we want someone that's different from everybody else. And like I said, we focus on that intense emotional experience, that high level of passion. In Eastern cultures that tend to be more collectivistic, what you see instead is that dependency and defining yourself in terms of the relationship is actually viewed very positively. And so you're really looking for that dependency, and you might define yourself as the wife of someone or as the husband of someone, and that's really what you're striving for. So that, the American might ask, how does my heart feel about this person? Whereas someone from China, as an example, might ask, well, what are other people going to say about this person? Because there are just different goals there, right? Whether you as an individual are going to be happy with this person, or whether you're concerned about your partner fitting in with the group as a whole. Whether you're concerned about obligation to others in addition to your own personal feelings. Okay? So it's just very, very interesting that culture can even shape the way that we view love and what we strive for in a relationship. The next phase of the family life cycle is the joining of families in marriage. Okay, so why is this worded this way? Why is it not just called marriage? Why is it called the joining of families in marriage? Well, it's because marriage does not just join the two individuals, but it really joins the two entire family systems. And this can be challenging. So if you don't really care for your spouse-to-be's family, that's definitely something to seriously consider, because they will be a part of your life. Okay, so one thing that we have to establish in a marriage is the marital roles. So what does that mean? Marital roles. Well, we have to decide who's going to do what, right? So if you have a traditional marriage, who has what role? In a traditional marriage, the husband works outside the home, and the woman stays at home and takes care of the household and of the children, technically, right? Now, what we've seen is more and more transition to, instead of traditional households, moving towards what we call egalitarian marriages where there's more equal contribution from both partners. Okay. Now, if you and your partner come from very different backgrounds in terms of religion, in terms of culture, ethnicity, it's going to be harder for you to develop those marital roles or to come to agreement on what the marital roles are going to be because you might come to the marriage with very different ideas about that. Okay, so let's look and see what's actually happening. If you think about this comparison between traditional marriages and egalitarian marriages, what do we actually see? Well, this chart looks at the number of hours per week that are spent on housework, and it's looking at wives and husbands and others in single earner couples, which is when the husband works outside the home only, dual earner couples where both husband and wife are working outside the home, and then a combination of all family types. And what do you see? Well, you see that even in a dual earner household, women continue to do most of the work, right? They're averaging almost 3 times as many hours as their husbands in that situation. The total number of hours that's devoted to housework is lowest in these families, probably because they tend to have fewer children or they tend to hire help. But even if they have hired help, you see that the wife is still putting in many, many more hours. So true egalitarian marriages are pretty rare, and couples who are striving for an egalitarian marriage probably are attaining a marriage that's somewhere in between true egalitarianism and traditionalism. Okay. Now, in terms of marital satisfaction, the research shows that there are several predictors of whether you feel satisfied in your marriage or not. This is not a comprehensive list of all of the predictors of marital satisfaction, but it's some of the more important ones. Okay, so you see here that being more similar in terms of your family background, similar in terms of social class, education, and religion, contributes to being more satisfied in your marriage. If you're very different from one another, that contributes to marital dissatisfaction. Also, the age you were when you get married. So if you're older than age 20, that tends to predict happier marriage. Younger than age 20, a less happy marriage. Also, the length of the courtship. So, how long you dated, how long you got to know each other before getting married. You want to strive for at least 6 months, right? Because those are the happier marriages. Those that happen in less than 6 months tend to have less happy marriages. And then also the timing of the first pregnancy. What happens after the birth of the first baby and also over the course of the first year of marriage is that marital satisfaction tends to decline. Okay, so whether you're similar or different or younger or older, it doesn't really matter. In that first year of marriage, you're going to tend to see a decline in marital satisfaction, probably as you're working out those marital roles and really figuring out what it's like to live together and to share a life together. And then also after the first baby is born, you see a dip in marital satisfaction. So it's best if you can wait until after that first year of marriage to have the first baby. Those who had a baby before or within their first year tend to be not as happily married. Okay. There are also some clear sex differences in marital satisfaction. So who do you think reports being more happily married, men or women? Men actually report being more happily married than women do. And if you look at the effects of marriage on men and women, marriage is associated with gains in men's mental and physical health, whereas married women are less healthy than single women in every respect, emotionally, physically. So why is that? Well, one could be that marriage is taking a heavy toll on women who are overwhelmed by the demands of husband, children, household, and career, right? We saw from that last chart that women really are taking on the bulk of the household work, even if they're working outside the home. And it can also be that men and women tend to have different approaches to conflict in marriage. So let's say there's a problem, there's a conflict. How does the woman typically want to handle this? She usually wants to talk about it, right? So she says to her husband, "We need to talk." And how does the husband respond to that? Well, probably with dread and wanting to do anything but. Okay, so men do tend to withdraw from conflict. And Gottman, Gottman, Gottman has all of this interesting research on married couples and conflict and the effects of men on women. And in one study, men and women were brought into the lab and they were connected to all of these physiological measures like heart rate and skin conductance to see how much they sweat, etc. And then they were told by the experimenter, in a few minutes, someone's going to come in here and ask the two of you to talk about a recent argument that you had and resolved because we're interested in how you solved that. And then they leave the room. Well, just with that introduction, men's physiological measures go through the roof. Their heart rates speed up, they sweat more, right? And this is just in anticipation of discussing an argument that's already been had and resolved. Okay, so men just tend to have this very adverse reaction to any kind of conflict, and so they tend to withdraw from it and avoid it as much as possible. Whereas women really want to talk about it, want to try to work on it, and so this mismatch may cause some stress for females in a marriage. Now, in terms of marital expectations and myths, what is one of the myths of marriage that you can think of? Happily ever after, right? Or marital bliss, that everything's going to be perfect now that we're married. Now, the more realistic your expectations are when you get into the marriage, the better off you're going to be in that first year, right, in terms of adjusting to the marriage. And so that's why having premarital counseling, whether it's at a church or somewhere else, is actually very much recommended and useful because you can get some of those expectations and myths on the table and work those out ahead of time rather than working them out in the context of the marriage itself. Okay? Because sometimes when these myths and expectations are overturned by actual experience, you might feel disappointed, disillusioned. The marriage then becomes less satisfying. The couple begins to argue more. So you kind of want to work that out ahead of time so that the two of you both have more realistic expectations, and that will help your adjustment to the marriage. Now, one study was asking college students how much they endorsed several different statements about marriage, and college students endorsed several following beliefs that were really not supported by the facts. So one belief that they endorsed was that marital satisfaction increases through the first year, and as I've already talked about, it actually decreases. They also thought that the best single predictor of marital satisfaction is what? What do you think? They thought it was the quality of the sex life. And that's not true. It's not the single best predictor. It's important, but it's not the single best predictor. They also thought if my spouse loves me, he or she should instinctively know what I want and need to be happy. So that's not so great. That's not a great expectation to have, that your spouse is going to be able to read your mind. And the last one was, no matter how I behave, my spouse should love me simply because he or she is my spouse. Also probably not a good expectation to have. Not a whole lot of unconditional love in adulthood, right? You do have to sort of behave yourself even if you're married and if your spouse loves you.